Let me get this straight. I know what you're thinking by the title, but what if I were to say it wasn't going to go the exact way you thought it was? I mean, AVGN influenced Irate Gamer, but the Nostalgia Critic created Baseball Sam 1. I could end the video here, and I'm sure no one would be mad at my decision because it's pretty obvious who the superior ripoff is. And yet, AVGN also made Game Dude, the guy who fled the country after stalking his ex-girlfriend and made lip-sync videos to try and get her back, along with also yelling at his parents for giving him a circumcision. Maybe this won't be as easy as I thought. Doug Walker and James Rolfe, otherwise known as the Nostalgia Critic and the Angry Video Game Nerd respectively, are quite the odd bunch. Both began revolutions of ironic and angry criticism from multiple different mediums in the early 2000s. Back in the day, they were the masters of their craft, and each still continues to make content today. They ended up leading different paths after multiple crossover specials, and in the end gave us one big change between the two other than the things they reviewed. That being one rose through the ranks thanks to their earnest efforts to make well-edited, entertaining content, and the other, and hear me out on this, was Doug Walker. Not that Doug didn't have those same ideals in the beginning, but after 2013 or so, he started showing a couple irregularities in attitude. Granted, his content wasn't considered amazing to begin with, but he seemed to grow more and more irregular as years went on. Well, to get into the rises and falls of careers, comparing them and analyzing them, there's no better place to start than the history of those individuals on their long journey through a place consisting of 80% porn and 20% of everything else including them, though Brad Jones did blur the line a little bit. Anyhow, the basic history. On July 10th, 1980, James Rolfe was born in Haddonfield, New Jersey. James grew up loving two things more than anything else in life: video games and filmmaking. He loved NES, SNES, and so on, as any 80s kid did, and played them relentlessly. He also loved films from the bygone era and was a huge fan of anything horror. James's earliest filmmaking came in a 1989 video he made where he tries to attack a punching bag. Obviously, it was bad, but it led to him creating his website Santa Massacre and dozens upon dozens of amateur films and shorts. Then in 2004, he created his most popular character. You know him, you love him, the cow-fucking cocksucking bullshit-chucking wife-cucking angry video game nerd, originally the angry Nintendo nerd. The series wasn't really even gonna be a series to begin with, just a trilogy, but thanks to overwhelming popularity, James went on to make a movie, games, over 160 episodes, and I'm guessing a Game Boy accessory sometime in the future. Don't know how he'll make it work. But James wasn't just the nerd, he was a man of many separate personifications, like a guy who murdered his friends during a board game and a talking pile of bullshit who tells you about the minor inconveniences in life, but behind his produced series, James made his Monster Madness reviews and other such critiques without the exaggeration and simply was himself. He currently sits at over 3 million subscribers, and I can't say it's undeserved. Creating, editing, acting, and producing all his shows for the most part by himself for over a decade, while never really losing that sincerity from the beginning and taking pride in all he makes because it's his passion. Just a year after James was born, on November 17th, 1981, in the large Italian city of Naples, Doug Walker was born. Just like James, Doug was very into film, especially old Disney films like Mary Poppins. He grew up moving around the world with a father in the military and eventually settled in Chicago, Illinois. Presumably he was a janitor or something like that for some sort of dead-end company for some sort of dead-end job until he became the Nostalgia Critic in 2007. He created his first Nostalgia Critic video on the original Transformers movie by Michael Bay, which was new at the time, so it's not really nostalgic. I guess the property is nostalgic, but the movie itself wasn't, so I guess it doesn't really hold up to scrutiny after all this time. Doug was able to gain a greater fame over time, in part thanks to his collaborations with James and having a fake ongoing rivalry with him. At the time, Doug hadn't created any video-type productions before, so he enlisted Bhargav Duranmaraju to edit for him. Nostalgia Critic was based around a guy making videos about old nostalgic movies and criticizing them with an angry personality. Sound familiar? NC did come out about 3 years after AVGN, so it's not entirely preposterous to think he got some quote-unquote inspiration. Nostalgia Critic nonetheless became very popular and got Doug a lot more contributors to his website, thatguywiththeglasses.com, later renamed Channel Awesome. Doug made multiple anniversary specials with the major contributors of way too long lengths, ending in To Boldly Flee, a 3.5-hour long experience, all edited by Doug himself. That special originally killed off the Nostalgia Critic because Doug wanted to move on and not be solely associated with the character. He would in the end go back to being associated with the character, but he got up to another project before bringing the NC back, the infamous Demo Reel. Demo Reel consisted of Doug and his crew making terrible, unfunny skits about movies for over 30 minutes at a time. Fans hated it, and not a single person seemed to be on board other than Doug, who wanted to try his shot at pure comedy, and shocker, showed his unprofessional filmmaking level along with it. Doug decided to bring back the Nostalgia Critic with this big campaign to make better content, earning over $90,000 in the process. His beginning project was Pop Quiz Hotshot, a badly made game show that looked like it had been filmed in the back alleys of Detroit. It has no production value, so fans were hoping all that money was going to be put into the revival. It wasn't. Where the money went is considered one of the biggest mysteries of our world today, because, let's be real, it sure as fuck was not spent on the show.
How close? Decent costume, clever writing, good-looking guy underneath?
It's time to stop!
Through the next several years, Doug made Nostalgia Critic videos with tons of skits and long gags. I'll have more to say on that later, but that's the best way to summarize NC from 2013 to 2018. Why 2018? Though there's much to say in the way of the not-so-awesome documents, I'll simply summarize here with Doug and his company being proven as both inadequate and still headstrong in the worst possible ways. I know I sound vague, but that's only since I'll be getting deeper into specifics later, and by later, I mean now. Let's start. Production! James Rolfe is and has been very well versed in film. He's created them since he was a kid and grew up wanting to be a filmmaker. He has a bachelor's degree in fine arts with a minor in hand-drawn animation. His skill was apparent even from the earliest episodes of AVGN. Videos like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Spider-Man to name a few showed he could light a scene, make decent costumes for characters, recreate shots and parody, and use both practical and computer-enhanced effects, however amateur some may be. And this was all in the early to mid-2000s, far before the rapid increase in professional teams creating full-fledged videos. James was really an inspiration to better content. With his animating skills, he created visuals not many others could create, such as in his Atari Jaguar video and such. Though it might seem primitive now, he was really awing to see back in the early 2000s when there was nothing like this for internet show creators. As he grew, he honed his craft and raised the stakes of his visuals like any content creator should. He learned to use green screen, he practiced choreography, he lined up better shots, and his visual effects only improved in both practical and digital aspects. He also sometimes would have small skits during the videos as parodies of games, their franchises, or certain aspects he highlighted in the review, but even if they weren't always necessary, they'd usually have nice sets, good effects, and were so well made it fit in well with the rest of the review. An easy example is in the Berenstein Bears video, which gave criticism and commentary on the mostly dull generic games, but also added subtle hints of the time paradox theory, making the nerd more and more outraged until he got to his house and a weird over-the-top skit plays out. In this nature, the skit fits seamlessly with the rest of the review, and if you were going to try and attempt such a thing, you'd want to fit the skits into the review without having them be too long or take away from the review itself, mostly just being little hints until it led up to the big conclusion. Granted, James' humor can be less sophisticated and predictable, but his sailor profanities are part of the character, and it's hard to see the nerd without it, and even with that, he sometimes does have some very good jokes in there. On some occasions, he does go for a bit too long, but it's never too often, and it usually is somewhat entertaining at least. Doug Walker, on the other hand, has never been that big of a movie-making guy. He did study film at Northern Illinois University, but he majored in communications rather than filmmaking. For the longest time, he had the template of, guy sits in front of white wall, guy makes fun of movie by giving a thorough plot synopsis with few and far between critiques, guy reviews the film in the last 2 minutes, maybe. Most people were fine with that. Nostalgia Critic wasn't a complex series and didn't require much for the fans to like it. When he did try to attempt effects, that's a different story entirely. We all have the classics, bad cropping, middle school level drawings, neon text, the works. Nostalgia Critic wasn't as much liked for his visuals, rather than a Nostalgia Critic character and making jokes disguised as criticism. By season 6, he decided to up the ante and make better production. It didn't end well. He got actors together, started using more green screen, and upped the comedy to the 11th degree. He got backlash for it at the time, and he still does today. He showed early signs before killing off the Nostalgia Critic that he wanted to employ more comedy into his videos, starting in season 5's last episode for the Scooby-Doo movie. That video has overly long skits with terrible costumes, boring set design and camera work, and everyone acts like they don't want to be there other than Doug. The video has almost 13 minutes and 38 seconds of skits. That's over a third of the entire video. Some would give this video the benefit of the doubt for originally being the last NC episode, so I'll compare it to his most recent Kim Possible review. It's still almost 6 minutes of skits spaced out mostly at the beginning and right at the end. Doug continues to have barely any sets outside of badly implemented green screens, giving his video a much more fake and artificial feeling to them. The boring shot composition doesn't help either. His effects haven't really leveled up in the past 4 years, so it gives me the feeling that Doug is simply too lazy to hire a visual artist and thinks he can do it all by himself despite needing a moderately sized crew to make what he does now, which isn't that much. In production, Doug suffers noticeably. Integrity! Of these two, what is something so profound about them that this aspect of their channels can go unspoken without anyone being confused? Talking about nostalgic properties. AVGN reviews games from the 80s to early 2000s, while Nostalgia Critic reviews movies from around the same time period. In this regard, James has stayed mostly faithful to his content. He looks at mostly NES, SNES, Genesis, N64, and PlayStation era games. He looks at the same era when it comes to game accessories, random failed consoles, etc., etc. At worst, James went to the beginning of the Xbox 360's life cycle with Sonic 06. For the most part, he's still entirely faithful to what he was before. Hold on a second. It's the head of redundancy department, redundancy. Doug Walker doesn't do something I previously informed people James Rolfe did? Never would have guessed. Doug was faithful to his persona and his rules at one point. Then he tried to kill off that persona, and in bringing it back, he said he wouldn't review any films still in theaters with that persona. He found a way, people. He found a way. He decided to make clipless reviews and still currently does today. What is a clipless review? Well, it's demo reel, but Nostalgia Critic cuts in with his own wacky comments on the situation and how the production is really bad, and in turn, because they have tried to acknowledge their own mediocrity, they are geniuses of comedy. I am rolling on the floor laughing like the man-child that I am. Aha! 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 Unlike James, Doug doesn't really know how to use a green screen or how to integrate characters into the environment he sets up for them, thus every character is on the same static background, almost no complexity in sight. Back in the good old days, Doug only had to miss key points in a review and show the point he missed in a clip he doesn't address but puts it in the video anyways. Now in the year 21XX, he can create his own clips from his recollection of a film he saw in theaters, to bend the clips to his own will in service of whatever narrative he wants to push. That way you can't look into it unless you want to drop $12 to go and see the film yourself. No one other than Doug's incessant fans like the clipless reviews. Every commentator under the sun has made videos denouncing him for his dishonesty and how info about the film was presented, his promise to not sink to such a low, and they especially rag on him for trying to revive demo reel and a type of spiritual successor that never really got off the ground. For a review. Although AVGN is mostly known for coming up with a modicum of various insults at games, he does give actual critiques to give a reason for those insults. He complains about bad controls, how stiff or weightless characters feel, level layout, graphics, character design, creativity, odd mistakes, and so on. The reason for that is obvious. You need to spend many hours going through a game. Not only that, you have to be actively involved with how a game plays out, no pun intended, and if the story and boss levels and so on move forward or stop based on whether you can make way. To make a video talking about a video game, you have to talk about all the aspects you liked and disliked in spending so much time on it. You can't simply comment on the story or the graphics or the frame rate for the whole video. You need to talk about everything because you experience so much, so you have a lot to talk about. Movies are somewhat different. At most you spend 3 hours watching a well-produced, big-budgeted experience telling a full story in an easy single sitting. Not that you aren't able to review a movie in as many ways as a video game. Cinematography, graphics, acting, they share more qualities than some might think, but movies are still much shorter and require not as much investment. With that huge margin of difference, someone like the Nostalgia Critic can exist. 95% of his video will be nothing but plot synopsis and unfunny skits and jokes with a minor sum up at the end. The formula will go something like this. First 2 or 3 minutes talking about what the film is, basic plot, and fun facts. After or before the segment includes an overly long 2 to 3 minute sketch which will inevitably be brought back up in the end. 10 to 30 minutes are spent with a Nostalgia Critic going through the entirety of the film, playing a clip then commenting on it, playing a clip then commenting on it, repeated. 5 times out of 10, NC will have some version of himself or other various characters come on and do some whole spiel specifically for NC to constantly poorly refute throughout the video. On special occasions it works out, but most of the time the skit goes on for so long that the point is moot. Another 2 to 3 minutes is used recapping the film and him finally saying his full opinion, that is, as full as 3 minutes can be. The last 3 to 5 minutes are spent reincorporating the skit from before, sometimes in a music video, other times not having a point at all. I do realize he criticizes the movie every few minutes or so, but I don't count most of these because they're usually invalid, i.e. his Sailor Moon, Jungle Book live action, and Deadpool 2 video. In all these reviews he misreads the tone by thinking the Jungle Book is some sort of edgy remake despite being made for kids, thinks Sailor Moon was only liked by girls and pubescent boys for having costumes he deems slutty, and believes Deadpool 2 isn't self-aware of the cliches it's taking on, and completely misreads what makes Deadpool funny as a character. Throughout the video, he constantly brings these points back up in a half-assed way with little evidence to try and string along the message he wants to shove down your throat by the end. Nostalgia Critic is predictable in every way, even in him containing huge inaccuracies. AVGN does have a similar type of ending, destroying the game or console he played, but at least he changes it up and makes the way he destroys the games unique each time and doesn't always use that ending. He could also go without using that ending quite as much as he does, but I find it more forgivable than when the NC likes to pull this all the time. Other series. Okay, when I say other series, I mean produced series. None of the Walker's first viewing, sibling rivalry videos, or James and Mike Mondays. Instead, I'll talk about Bored James, You Know What's Bullshit, Bum Reviews, and Video Game Confessions. Both series from each respective creator can be compared in many ways. Video Game Confessions and You Know What's Bullshit are both short-form series with 2 characters played by the creators with drawn visual accompaniment, though not as often in You Know What's Bullshit's case. Video Game Confessions has Doug play a bartender at a video game bar who tells stories about characters from popular games coming in. James and You Know What's Bullshit plays the bullshit bullshit man, a guy who complains about random inconveniences. He basically plays the nerd character, but as a talking pile of bullshit, and I do mean that literally. James has a nicely made mask he wears to portray the character in the newerish videos without needing to put on some kind of annoying voice. Nostalgia Critic puts on an annoying Australian accent. I commend him for the effort of trying to come off as a different person, but he just sounds like a Westerner trying to put on a British accent and accidentally putting on an Australian accent. James' visuals also look better. That's because rather than drawing the images himself, even though he does no animation, James has his friend and artist Mike Matee to draw stylistic images for him. He also has more editing than a video game confessions video, which always has Doug going back and forth between talking in an accent on a black background to live drawing from the story he's telling. Thanks to that lackluster editing, Doug's videos feel longer than they are, which is only about 7 minutes tops. James uses time more sparingly, knowing he talks about a trivial issue and only talks for however long he needs to. Sometimes it's 4 minutes, sometimes a single minute, never feeling stretched out. Overall, both have some small aspects over one another, but James' videos are superior for the key reasons I pointed out. Bum Reviews and Bored James are also characters played by the channel creator, but the difference here is those characters at some point interact with the main character in their shows. They also play characters more reminiscent of themselves. James plays a more composed character, calmer, likes board games, and possibly killed his friends and blamed the game for it. Doug plays a nostalgia critic in a wig and flasher trench coat with a slightly altered voice. He's supposed to be a homeless stoner coked out of his mind, but during every video he has a point where he breaks character and makes a long analytical comment or just loses the voice and doesn't try to get it back. I could compare these two, but Bored James is produced on a similar level to AVGN with different characters, and Bum Reviews is lower quality than Nostalgia Critic is. It's got almost no editing other than jump cuts, and has Doug ranting in the same way he does for the NC. That's all I can really say about that. James Rolfe isn't an idiot who thinks he's making the next big blockbuster. Okay, there was that one time, but other than that one time, we don't really need to talk about that, because we don't talk about that piece of shit in this household. Much larger videos have gone into much more detail about the various controversies brought to light in the Not So Awesome documents. I'm only going to talk about the most serious accusations at Doug and Rob for their unprofessionalism, and briefly mention Mike Machad. The Not So Awesome document was posted by members of the Channel Awesome site who wanted to voice everything going on behind closed doors up until that point, revealing Doug and Rob as incompetent and their CEO Mike Machad is much, much worse. Almost every member of Channel Awesome has gone from the website due to the treatment some have received from Machad and to a lesser extent the Walkers. Mike Machad is a different entity all unto himself, favoring men over women, firing Obscurus Lupra for being 15 minutes late to a Skype call, covering up sexual predators on the site for multiple years without letting anyone know, and so much more. That includes being childish, bullying all contributors who weren't Doug, firing people on a dime if they mouthed off to him, giving people orders and going back on those same orders. It goes on forever if you let it. I'm only going to go into detail about Doug because he had a smaller but still sizable mention in the documents. He was stated to have been so incompetent he couldn't operate MP3 Skype recorder, which only requires a single button push. He also apparently has no idea how to commentate and simply records with the mic attached to his camera instead of separately. Doug would also constantly jam up the Christmas feed for his website with Disney December vlogs, not giving anyone else in the company a chance to be put up even if they did a lot more work than he did. Doug filmed the Quiz Hotshot pilot over a dozen times because the room he and the staff bought wasn't sound dampened and the echo was intolerable. This is another good example of Doug's own incompetence to the point of wasting money reshooting. Doug doesn't really know how to direct people. His usual direction was to act more like he would, and if someone didn't want to do that, he'd just ask them to do both ways so he could choose the one that he wanted. Doug can't be on time with scripts either, constantly fighting with his brother Rob over various ways it should be written. You probably wouldn't think this would happen, but the Walker brothers have many unneeded fights on set, always slowing production down, and you better not disagree with the script Doug writes, because he will need tons and tons of talking down to even alter scenes. He allows almost no input. Despite how he gets into fights on set and doesn't allow much needed change, Doug is always oblivious to however miserable his cast is. This is speaking on his To Boldly Flee special, which Doug made people film sometimes for 18-hour days with little sleep in between. Even with these kinds of man hours, Doug and Rob found ways to give the film tons of plot holes, which Rob would simply shrug off as such, rather than either addressing the continuity for comedy reasons or fixing the scene to begin with. I can't really complain though. Doug and Rob sometimes don't even want to finish the project they begin work on, like Suburban Nights. The incompetency of thinking your cast won't want to finish a project having already finished most of their scenes baffles me. The only thing I found more baffling was that he didn't provide a craft services table on the set of Kick-Assia, just like Tommy Wiseau didn't for The Room. Doug. I don't want to paint Doug as some sort of horrid monster. He had plenty of good experiences with other contributors, but he's done some shitty things. That's due mostly to his own ego and whatever he's able to control, but complete subservience to anyone higher up on the corporate ladder, that being Machad. Doug got to witness firsthand how how much worse Mike could be than him, and decided to do nothing but make decisions he favored. The only comparison to AVGN I can put here is that James hasn't done this kind of shit because he stayed in control of his property and isn't controlling the actions of others. Oh, and James can direct people with more instructions than to act more like he should. In the end of this video, if you somehow can't understand why most people like James and not Doug, and there's a good reason for liking one and not liking the other, you didn't make it this far and have spent the last 20 or so minutes typing a long comment for me to read and be entertained by. So hey, thanks anyway. See you guys later. Don't end up like a Doug Walker. Be more like a James Rolfe.